You guys may or may not have realized this about me yet, but I really love stories. I can completely lose myself in a well-crafted story. I can get a relatively equal amount of enjoyment out of trying to fix a story that isn't as well written, but I really do love well-built stories. One such story is Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. Now granted, I haven't read the books in a few years, so my knowledge of the series is a little rusty, but you can be sure that when I was younger, they were some of my favorite books of all time. And they were favorites for quite a few other people, and as tends to happen to most popular books and or book series, they received adaptations. The first of which was a movie that came out several years ago and covered the first 3 books of the series. That movie is what I'm going to be reviewing for you guys today. It's hard to describe a series of unfortunate events to anyone who hasn't read them. At the end of the day, the best way that I can put these books into words, aside from just having you read the words that make them up yourself, is to say that A Series of Unfortunate Events was a series that built a world in which literary devices had real substance. A play on words could be a weapon. A slightly altered character description could be a disguise. It was a series full of wit and charm that came from the structure of the words on the page. And it's for that reason that more than probably any other book series in existence, A Series of Unfortunate Events is almost impossible to successfully adapt into a visual medium. And despite that, the movie didn't actually do a bad job, for the most part, and we'll get into that in a second. The aesthetic of the movie is spot on, the books. They have this timeless feel to them. You can't really pin down what era they're supposed to be set in. And it feels absolutely intentional. This isn't the case of the author not being able to decide on what time period to set his books in. It was very obvious that he intended for these stories to feel timeless. And even though the movie only covered the first 3 books of the series, the story itself was, for the most part, completely intact. That being the story of the Baudelaire orphans Klaus, Violet, and Sunny, as they attempt to evade the evil Count Olaf, who is after their family fortune, while reeling from the loss of their parents, their home, and everything they own in a terrible fire. The books themselves are filled with all kinds of mystery and intrigue, a puzzle that is slowly pieced together as the series progresses, as the kids learn more and more about their parents and a secret society of which they were a part. Things unravel and click into place and make perfect sense in a world that often doesn't. And if I had to point out one major flaw in the movie, it's that it just doesn't get far enough into the story for any of that to really come to pass. Plot threads are barely dangled in front of you and then have no resolution whatsoever. Because even though each of the books did tell a self-contained story with a beginning, middle, and end, the series itself very clearly had a story of its own, with its own beginning, middle, and end. And we barely got the beginning. It's pretty clear, too, that when the movie was being adapted, someone somewhere realized that. Someone somewhere realized that they weren't going to be able to adapt this story perfectly and that they needed to make changes. Details that are very prominent in the books, that are called attention to by the narration of the books, are just kind of there in the background of the movie. Attention really isn't called to them. They're there so that if more movies had been made later and more details were introduced later in those movies, people could look back and say, oh, hey, those details were there all along. And I don't fault the crew working on the movie for doing this. It makes perfect sense. But I feel like when this movie was being made that someone should have realized that a movie really isn't the medium for this story. But we'll get to that in a second. There are 2 major complaints regarding this movie that I want to address. One is a pretty common complaint amongst fans of the books. That being that when the movie was being made, the crew working on the movie kind of realized that as they were adapting 3 books into one movie, the story was going to end up feeling like it had 3 equally valid climaxes. And so the first third of the story, covering the first book, was given a new ending. And the climax of the first book was moved to the end of the movie. It was inflated a little bit and treated as the climax of those 3 stories as a whole. And I don't know if this is going to be an unpopular opinion or not, because as far as I can tell, this detail is pretty divisive amongst the fandom, but I think that's a fantastic idea. The movie already feels like 3 shorter movies slapped together. Tacked on or not, this tactic did give the movie a more satisfying climactic ending than it would have otherwise had. Even though no other movies in this movie series were made, moving the climax of the first book to the climax of the movie gave the movie its best chance at getting a sequel. So at the end of the day, I have absolutely no problem with that. I did, however, have a problem with something else. While most of the actors in this movie did a perfectly reasonable job, at their very worst, with many of them playing their parts spectacularly, I absolutely could not stand Jim Carrey as the villain Count Olaf. He's just so bad. Jim Carrey has 2 acting modes, crazy comedic or crazy dramatic. There's no in between. And bafflingly, either the producer or the director or Carrey himself decided to go with the first. And so Count Olaf was played throughout the entire movie as a joke character. And in some ways he is, because as I mentioned before, in the universe in which these books take place, literary devices have real weight in the world. A turn of phrase can be a potent weapon. Knowledge of words could save the day. Reading literally gave people power. And the main characters of the story, Klaus, Violet, and Sunny, are very intelligent, well-spoken, well-read individuals. And as things were primarily told from their perspective, the antics of Count Olaf came off as pretty ridiculous. They were able to see through practically everything he did. So there was a certain amount of ridiculousness to his character, for sure. But that's what made Count Olaf so terrifying. Because here you have 3 children, one of them is a baby, by the way, who are able to see through the villain's schemes, and yet none of the adults in the story take them seriously. So when Count Olaf waltzes onto the scene with a Saturday morning cartoon Scooby-Doo villain plot, and the kids immediately see through it, and yet Count Olaf's plots still work, it's scary because a trope, a very well-known trope, has been expertly subverted. After just a couple of books, you kind of get the sense that Count Olaf can get away with anything in this world. And that the only people that these characters have that they can rely upon are each other. Not only that, but there's virtually no humor in the books at all. There's wit, certainly, but most of the wit comes from clever turns of phrase, clever literary devices, clever narration, and clever dialogue. It isn't humorous wit. It's wit in and of itself. And that's just not something that translates to a visual medium at all. You can try to include some narration, but you can't narrate an entire movie. And seeing as how this is a story that's very depressing at its core, children's parents die in fire and then children are relentlessly pursued by a villain, that sucks. No one wants to watch that. Seeing as how that's the case, there has to be something to appeal to audiences. And if it can't be the wit that stemmed from the writing, what else could it be other than comedy? And so a very dour and depressing and yet still witty and, at the end of the day, inspiring story ended up turning into a mediocre comedy. Count Olaf is virtually impossible to take seriously in this movie, and Carrey's performance as Count Olaf just came off as any other Jim Carrey performance. At the end of the day, I don't recommend watching this movie. If you're interested in the story of a series of unfortunate events, a series where clever writing permeates every page, I'd recommend seeking it out in a different medium. Which brings me back to my comment earlier about how I don't feel like a movie is the proper medium for this story. If one insists upon adapting it to a visual medium, it really would work better as a series. And thanks to Netflix, the first season of that series has been released. And I do plan on reviewing it sometime in the next few days. Until then, though, guys, what did you think of this movie? If you disagree with me, please, I'd like to know why. There's, of course, much more I could have said about this movie, and I do plan to touch on a little bit more about the movie itself when talking about the show. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.